I'd like to introduce and welcome John Shoraka. And I want to prepare you just a little bit for what's about to happen. It's going to be a little bit like drinking water from a fire hose, because John knows everything, right? He's really got both the big picture and the wonderful detail of what you need to know. John is formerly with the SBA, and I'm going to let John talk about that. But he's just got a wealth of information. There's no chance we're going to get through all your slides, John. I don't think that's going to happen. But we'll do our best. And are you sticking around for questions after the event and so on? Okay.
I'll be at the networking event too. So.
All right, wonderful. All right, all yours.
Awesome.
And there's the remote.
Thank you. Thank you, Jess. And thank you to the National Center for having us and including us in these events. We've participated in these all over the country, so it's great to be here. It's great to see some familiar faces. Like Jess said, this is just a slide deck that I try to stick to. A lot of times I end up not sticking to it because I like to kind of have more of a dialogue with the audience rather than you guys listening to me for, I think it's an hour and a half, and a lot of times I'm like, there's no way I can speak for an hour and a half. And by the end, it's like I haven't gotten to all the topics. So what I really like to try to do is keep it conversational and have you guys, there was a lot of good questions earlier this morning about entity-owned companies. Entity-owned in my mind are Tribal, Alaska Native Corporation, Native Hawaiian organizations. Those all have special privileges in federal contracting. And there was a lot of good questions about organization and so forth. And then I know Chris is going to be going later on this afternoon, and we'll have a lot of information also with respect to contracting and getting into contracting and the assistance that the National Center provides through what used to be called PTACs, and now they're called APEX accelerators. So this is sort of the topics that I wanted to discuss. But before I get started, I guess I saw sort of an indication of folks that are tribal members, but maybe an indication of how many entity-owned, again, like firms that are owned by the tribe or the Alaska Native Corporation or Alaskan Village Corporation or the Native Hawaiian Organization. How many of those do we have? Or folks that may establish one of those? Okay. And then individually owned firms? Awesome. Do we have current government contractors? Current government contractors? Awesome. And then how many people are looking to get into the 8A program? Okay. Awesome. So that gives me an idea of sort of where to focus on, because there's always a mix of folks, right? There's always a mix of individuals that have already taken the first several steps, and then we want to talk about, okay, how do we leverage and scale those programs, and how do we do like mentor-protege and joint ventures, and what are the benefits of doing that, and what does that mean, and how's that environment changing, because all this environment constantly changes. So real quick, just told me not to forget this, my background. So I used to do federal contracting in my previous life. My dad started a firm, actually, interestingly enough, used to do a lot of USAID work, Asian Development Bank, World Bank, et cetera. Did that for like 20 years, chaired an association that represented small business government contractors, then went into the Obama administration at the SBA as a regional administrator. I had the Mid-Atlantic region with 7 district offices, and then I went to headquarters to run the federal government small business set-aside programs. So when you talk about the 8A, Hub Zone, Women-Owned, Service-Disabled, goaling the agencies, the mentor-protege, the joint venture, all those programs fell under my umbrella office. I did that for a period of 7 years, and since then have been doing advisory work, and like I said, we work with the National Center to provide training across the country as well. So real quick, the federal marketplace as an economic development tool is unique and critical, at least in my perspective, having been responsible for the program, for economic development in our communities, right? Because the federal government, and you guys probably know this, which is why you're here, is the largest buyer of goods and services in the entire world, not just the United States, in the entire world. And as opposed to the lending program, and I have no animosity, well, maybe a little bit because we used to compete with them, but as compared to the lending program at the SBA, where it's a loan and you have to pay it back, the federal contracting program is like oxygen for your companies to grow and benefit, right? And there are specific requirements to contract with our types of firms, right? And that number, 150 to 100, 120 to 150, has gone up over the years, in large part due to COVID spending, but it's gone up because the budget has increased. And every year, there's goals, right? There's a 23% goal for buying from small businesses. There's what we call the 5533, which is disadvantaged small business 8A, and I put 5% over there, but through presidential authorization or order, the goal for SDB 8A is now 15%, right? And it's going to creep up. They actually targeted 11% for last year, 12% for this year, but by 2024, 2025 is supposed to hit 15%. So the question is, are there enough firms to help us meet that 15%? And then there's a 5% women-owned, 3% service-disabled, and 3% hub zone. Real quick, how many women-owned small businesses do we have in here? Okay. How many hub zone firms? Okay, awesome. Service-disabled? Awesome. Thank you guys for your service. I know people always say that, but I really appreciate it. I do. The 5533, the federal government, when they say they're going to hit 15%, historically, they have always hit kind of like 10% anyway. So it's a little bit of cheating when they said we're increasing the goal from 5 to 15%. People thought, wow, that's enormous, right? But historically, over the last several years, probably like the last 7, maybe even longer, the federal government has hit 10 and 11%. So where the real test is going to come is in the next 3 years, right? Can they increase spend to hit the 15%, which creates a lot of opportunity for your firms, right? So if you are 8A certified or you can be 8A certified, it's an opportune time because the federal government is looking for more firms to help them meet that goal. And then the other thing that I would say is tribal entities. Tribal entities, if you're looking at it as an economic development tool, the 8A program is an incredible economic development tool for the tribal community because as a tribal organization, you can have multiple 8As, right? Unlimited. Some Alaska Native corporations have 13, 14, 15 8As. As long as each is individually small. And we'll talk about affiliation, but there's no affiliation between the sister companies. So as long as they're each individually small, they can participate in the 8A program. And the other unique characteristic of a tribally owned 8A is that they have access to unlimited sole source. So where an individual 8A is restricted at $4.5 million, a tribal 8A or an Alaskan Native or a Native Hawaiian organization at the Department of Defense can literally get an unlimited sole source. There's a justification and approval that the contracting officer has to write. I think it's at $22 million right now for civilian agencies, $100 million at the Department of Defense. 25 million, thank you, 25 million. And that is kind of a sticking point because contracting officers oftentimes don't like to have to write a justification and go to a higher authority and get approval. So there is a little bit of sticking point there, but technically tribal entities can do unlimited sole source. And so we work with a lot of tribes to help establish, and I think there was a question about governance and structure. The points were really well taken earlier, making sure that the entities are run as a corporation and a business as opposed to family and council, et cetera, and keeping the politics out of it. So oftentimes there's a structure of a Section 17, right? Department of Interior licensed authorized Section 17. Then you have a holding company, and then the holding company has the 8A entities under it. So you can have several entities under that holding company. That's a way that a lot of our clients and a lot of tribes establish their federal contracting structure, right? And they are usually organized under tribal governance and authority. And really, when it comes to tribal control, you have to demonstrate control from the tribe all the way down to the entity. So you can have outside board members, but the majority of the members have to be tribal members. And the tribal members have to always prevail in a decision, right? So when you apply to the 8A program, they're going to look at the structure from the tribe down to the Section 17, to the holding company, all the way down to the 8A applicant. And as long as you can demonstrate that the tribe always prevails, in other words, the tribal members are the majority, they can't be overruled because there's no unanimous consent provisions, and they will always prevail. Then you establish that control from the tribe all the way down to the 8A entity, right? And then you have the ownership question. And we'll talk a little bit about all of this with respect to requirements from the 8A program, but that's just sort of an initial overview of the 8A program. I think there's a question right here. But real quick, one thing that a lot of folks don't realize is that you get multiple credit or I shouldn't say you, the federal government gets multiple credit if you're the unicorn, right? If you're the 8A women-owned service-disabled hub zone, the federal government, if they give you $1 million contract, they get $1 million in each of those buckets. So it's important to, if you can qualify for all of these, to try to qualify for all of these. There can't be a multiple set aside. So the federal government can't say, hey, we're going to set this requirement aside for an 8A hub zone women-owned service disabled. However, you are more likely than not, all things being equal, you're more likely than not viewed favorably if you can help them meet their goal if they give you a contract, right? So tribes also have special privileges in the hub zone program, and we'll talk about that as well. So if you're a tribal entity and you have an 8A, right, you have access to unlimited sole source, right? So you get an unlimited 8A sole source. If you happen to be a hub zone firm as well, now the federal agency gets $100 million towards their 8A goal and $100 million towards their hub zone goal. So it makes you much more attractive, and it makes the federal government contracting officer's job easier with respect to meeting these goals, right? And one thing that I'll say, and then I'll see, because I know there was questions, the one thing that I'll say is that USA Spend, right? If you go to usaspend.gov, and if you ever go to one of these and they want to charge you, I think Chris is going to maybe talk about this when she talks. Don't pay for it, right? When you go to register for SAM, you're going to start getting emails. Now, granted, you may want assistance. You may want to hire, a third-party data like GovWin, like FedMine. You might want to pay for those things. You might want to pay for someone to help you get SAM registered, but why not go to Apex or one of the free resources? USA Spend is a great source of information, and FPDS, or SAM now, sam.gov, is a great source of information for multiple reasons. But USA Spend can tell you the goals for each of the agencies, if they're meeting their goals, which agencies aren't meeting what goals, and so it becomes sort of a way of determining where should I spend my limited marketing efforts in order to get the most bang for the buck. So let me stop right there. I know Chris is going to talk a little bit about these, so I'm not going to go in a lot of detail about SAM, but I do want to make some points on this. And by the way, this deck will be available to all the members. They usually send them out. So any questions so far? Yes, sir.
I did have a question. You mentioned like the difference between the individual and the ANC, 8A.
Yeah.
For the amount. I think I remember hearing from a mentor that
Yeah, good question. So the question was the length of the program for the 8A program, right? So most of these certifications are front-end certification programs, right? Even Service Disabled just transferred from VA to SBA, and it's now a front-end certification program. So, and small business, just regular small business, is self-representation, right? You go into SAM, you answer some questions, and you represent, you get in, you become or it tells you if you're small by answering some of the questions. For the 8A program, it's front-end certification, so you're going to go to SBA. There's a process to apply for the program. We'll talk about the requirements. For an individually owned firm, it is 9 years. And the way SBA looks at it is it's a business development program. So you have 9 years. In the first several years, you are able to get sole source opportunities, right? Like the 4.5, if you're individually owned, the $4.5 million. But they look at it as a business development opportunity, right, over 9 years. So in years 7, 8, and 9, it's the transitional years. So you're going to get weaned off the 8A sole source. So the question is, when do you want to apply for the 8A program? How many people are thinking about applying for the 8A program? Okay. So the question is, are you ready for the 8A program? Because the SBA, if you qualify, can't say no, but you also don't want to spin your wheels for the first 2 or 3 years, not taking advantage of the sole source opportunities, and then getting into year 7 and being like, oh, well, they're winning me off of sole source. So really, the question is, do you have some past performance? Do you have some strong relationships with the federal government? Do you have good demonstration of work and capabilities with the federal government? If you have those things, then you can, and once you get in the 8A program, it's not like people are just lining up to give you contracts, right? That doesn't happen. But if you have those relationships, then you can leverage your 8A sole source authority to say, hey, we've been doing great work here. By the way, we just became 8A, and do you have any work that can be directed to us, sole source, right? So yes, 9 years for individuals. Tribal, well, I'll say entity-owned, tribes, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiians, technically each individual entity that they own is in the program for 9 years. But the reason it's considered, or someone might say it's unlimited, is because once that 9 years is over, they can just pop in a second 8A, and then a third 8A. And so it is a unlimited participation in the program. Each individual entity is limited to 9 years. And for those tribally owned entities, there's a restriction with respect to being in the same industry. So if you have your first 8A as a tribe in, let's say, IT services, and I forget the NAICS code, 541611, I think it is, you can't have a second one in that NAICS code, in that primary NAICS code. So a lot of tribes will, and you can't have it for 2 years after graduating from the program. So a lot of tribes will stagger and map out. Like if you, we have some clients that are bigger Alaskan Native corporations. They'll have like boards of mapping out, these contracts are going to go here. When this ANC graduates, this 8A graduates, we have 2 years. Where are these contracts going to go? We're going to do some joint ventures, and then this one will get launched, and it'll be one NAICS code off, and it's far enough where we'll get approved. And so there's a whole strategy with respect to 8A number 2, 3, 4, and 5, and the NAICS code restrictions. But yes, technically, a tribe can be in the 8A program indefinitely. Correct. Any other questions? Yes.
John, are you going to talk about ISBs, or because I know HHS and Department of Interior are now, they've increased their set-asides for Indian economic enterprises, and especially ISBs.
Yeah. And I think Chris is going to talk about that later. But you're absolutely right. As I was sitting next to her, she was telling me how that's been expanded, and it might even be expanded further. But you'll talk about that during your session, right? Okay. Okay. And I think there was a question. Yeah.
I just want to make a comment, and I'm on the commercial side. And one thing that I want to make, that I really want to impress upon the room is that the dollars are green on the commercial side also. Gov is not the only way to go. And furthermore, if you are 8A eligible, that means that you are probably diverse.
Yeah.
Which means that you can get a third-party diverse certification that is going to be wholly relevant to the commercial side of the realm. We may not have set aside, because I run a supply diversity program, and we spend, I shouldn't say this out loud, we spend, let's assume $250 million directly with diverse-owned firms.
Yeah.
So there's real money there. So consider that also as part of your strategy as you look at avenues to grow.
Yeah.
Because it's entirely viable, and there is, last time I'm going to be Latino for the rest of my life. So therefore, I'm not going to not be certifiable. And so that one doesn't have a shelf life. Well, I mean, it does, but
Right. No, that's a good point. And diversification is important, right? So that's a good point. NMSDC, National Minority Small Business Development Council.
Supplier Development Council.
Thanks.
I used to be one of their presidents.
Awesome. Okay, so that's one. WeBank is another one. But yes, having those certifications and looking at the commercial sector, and the SBA is actually doing a lot of work with the commercial side of the world as well, and sort of the supply chain and introducing their small businesses to commercial supply chains. So yes, absolutely. Looking at diversifying is important. Yes, sir.
Well, I don't know if this might be covered later, but I guess for me, I'm just trying to think of how would you determine the best types of businesses or
Yeah.
services or things? How would you determine how to match your experience up with the contracting? How do you get there, or even
Yeah.
know what you could bid on?
So that's
to
a
get to that point?
Yeah, so that's a good point, because we've had more nascent sort of tribal clients looking to enter federal contracting, right? And look, so the initial thing that I would always say is make sure that you are institutionally established to do so. So what we talked about earlier, right? The governance, the tribal corporate code, all those things, the holding company, all those institutional things are established. That's, I guess, number one. Number two, like any other sort of small business, the first thing I'd do is, okay, do we have any industries that we potentially have strengths in? We worked with one tribe that was doing a lot of construction on reservation, right? So they had a lot of experience in construction. They were doing a lot of agriculture on reservation. They had a shared services team that was doing a lot of the corporate infrastructure, like staffing, all those things. So it's like, what are the things that we're potentially doing right now that could be relevant to the federal contracting marketplace? And then to the point earlier, you also can bring in subject matter expertise, right? Because one of the things with tribal entities is you can literally pop up a new corporate entity with no past performance. When you're looking at an individual 8A, you need to have 2 years of experience. You can ask for a waiver, right? And if you can demonstrate, I've been in this industry, I have potential clients, you might get that waiver, but it's very subjective by the SBA. For tribes, you can pop in a brand new corporate entity with no past performance, no experience, as long as you have a letter of commitment from the tribe that says we will support this entity, and you can show and demonstrate that they will support it, then you can pick any NAICS code. You can pick any industry. But I would do something that, even if you have subject matter expertise from the outside, I would do something that the tribe or some of its industry or personnel are familiar and have some experience in. The other thing, in talking to this slide, with respect to analysis of where am I going to look to market my product or service, right? So the government buys everything. But if you look at USA spend, you can look to see, are they buying what we're selling? And I think Chris is going to talk a little bit about this as well. But what I'll say is, you can pick a NAICS code, North American Industry Classification Code, and if I use an acronym that you guys don't know, please let me know, or a Professional Services Code, PSC, or Product Service Code, and you can track down who's buying what I'm selling. And it's not just USAID or Department of Defense. It can go down to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, right? So then the question is, do they buy one big contract, like $10 billion? Is that why it popped up? Or do they have thousands of $1 million contracts? Because that's more interesting for a small business, not the one $10 billion contract, right? So you look for plurality of opportunities. And once you start delving into this, then you really, because small businesses oftentimes do the shotgun approach, right? And then they get frustrated. And then they go out and buy, FedMine, and I'm not trying to discount FedMine or Bloomberg government, but they're expensive. They're very expensive. So they spend their money on that. They do the shotgun approach, and they're not successful, and then they give up. And the thing is, you got to be really targeted and structured, right? So you got to pick your top 5 and 10 or 10. Who's buying what I'm selling? And then how are they buying it, right? Are they doing 8A set aside? Are they doing woman-owned, small business, hub zone set aside? Are they friendly to the 8A program, right? Once you pick that out, then it's how are they buying it with respect to, are they individual one-off contracts, or are they using government-wide acquisition vehicles like CIOSP4, Alliant, STARS 3? I know I'm throwing a whole bunch of acronyms out there. Do you guys know what any of those are? Some? Okay, so if you're new to federal contracting, more and more, and unfortunately, this is something that's sort of picked up under the Obama administration, and I was there at the time, but more and more category management or these large government-wide vehicles are what agencies use. So they put out this big vehicle, and I'll talk about category management later, but they'll put out this large vehicle, and they'll say, hey, we used to buy widgets from millions of small businesses, but wouldn't it be more efficient if we bought them from 20 and drive down the prices because we buy on volume? So yes, it would be more efficient for the government. But what does that do to the thousands and thousands of small businesses that used to sell widgets to the federal government? So that sort of puts them kind of out of business. So the question is, how's the federal government buying products? Are they using some of these larger government-wide acquisition vehicles? Is there a partnership relationship? So just like you had the 5533 at the government level, large firms, and I think Sharon talked about matchmaking, right? Matchmaking isn't just with the federal government. You should look at matchmaking with large firms as well, because large firms have the same 5533 goals, if not higher. So they have to go small business, they have to have a subcontracting plan, they have to go 8A, they have to go women-owned, service disabled, and they get tracked on meeting those as well. So it's important to market yourself to the large businesses and the federal government. So going back to doing your homework, right? So who's buying what I'm selling? How are they buying it? Are they setting it aside? What kind of vehicles? Is there a partner relationship that I can pursue? And then once you start narrowing it down, yes, a lot of folks always say, I should talk to the acquisition folks. And no, I don't have anything against acquisition folks. Kevin used to be an acquisition contracting officer. But those guys are just executing against a requirement from the program office. So for folks who've been in federal government, program office gets the money, right? They have the money, they need to execute, the acquisition office executes against it. A program office has a good amount of say, although the contracting officers have to follow the regulations, they have a good amount of say on how that money gets spent. So it's important to know the program office and the acquisition office. And then the other part that a lot of folks forget is the small business office, right? So every large federal activity, like I threw out Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Aberdeen, HHS, NASA, every activity has a small business specialist. So if I'm interested in, I always say Wright-Patterson, but if I'm interested in Wright-Patterson, am I meeting with the small business specialists there? Because they're the ones that are required to meet that goal. They're the ones that are looking around to identify the small businesses to meet that goal. So are they having industry day? Are they having matchmaking? Am I attending those events and am I building those relationships? So it's sort of a multi-step approach, I guess, to identify where to focus on and if you are already in business, how to market. Any questions so far? Yes, sir.
I just
Yeah.
Can you give me your cut real quick on Oasis and how the small business and large business disparities will overlap in the category that they do?
Yeah, you mean if the requirement comes out, can they put it on one or both, or how do they do that? Technically speaking, so there was an interesting case. So the question was on Oasis, which is a category management government-wide acquisition vehicle. If an agency decides to use that vehicle, do they put it out as a small business set-aside? Do they put it out as a full and open? How does that work, right?
Actually, I was referring to Oasis Plus, the one coming out.
Okay.
That everybody's going to have their hair out.
Yeah.
I did have love.
Oh, okay. So yeah, my understanding is, to Kevin's point, it'll have different categories and swim lanes, right? So it'll have a full and open, small business, 8A, but I don't know that for a fact because I think it's in draft form, right? Yeah, I think. I could be wrong. Okay. Yeah, and look, so, but there was an interesting case just recently where the GAO, might have been in the Court of Federal Claims, stated that you basically have to decide where the set-aside is going to occur, if the set-aside is going to go small business, before you choose your vehicle. So a lot of contracting officers play the game where they're like, okay, I want to use Oasis. And then they do the analysis and say, oh, well, there's no two small businesses that can provide this product or service, so I don't have to set it aside. Well, Court of Federal Claims basically said, hey, you have to do your rule of two analysis first. You have to decide if there's two or more small businesses. And if there is, then you have to choose the right vehicle. You can't just choose a vehicle that doesn't have the small businesses to set it aside. How many folks know what the rule of two is? Some. Okay. So if you're in federal contracting, it's really, really, I mean, that is sort of the backbone of compliance when it comes to the federal government and small business set-aside. So when we talk about the 23% and the 5533, I'll come back to this slide. And when we talk about the 235533, how does that actually happen, right? So there is a requirement which we always present as the rule of two, which is if there are two or more small businesses that can provide the product or service at a reasonable price, right? Not the best price, but at a reasonable price, then that requirement must be set aside for a small business, right? Now, there isn't any hierarchy of do they go 8A first, do they go hub zone, do they go, it's dependent on the contracting officer's discretion and the goals they're not meeting and their market research. So the rule of two, if it's not being followed, who has the stick to make that, to implement it, right? So under my old office, there are folks that are called PCRs, Procurement Center Representatives. How many folks know what that is? Okay, a few. Okay, so those are your friends. Everybody should know. If you're in federal contracting, you should know what a PCR is. Now, we're just talking over lunch. Unfortunately, and I can say this now, you can talk to your congressman. Unfortunately, when I was running the program, I started with like 200 and something PCRs. When I left in 2017, I felt bad because we were down to 119. Now, I thought they were at 70. I understand they're at 40. So you imagine 40 procurement center representatives to cover the thousands and thousands and thousands of buying activities across the country to enforce the rule of two, right? So anything that does not get set aside has to be signed off by a procurement center representative. So if you see a sources sought, if you see a request for information, I know you guys always hear this, but it's important to respond to that. Why? Because that builds the file that there are two or more small businesses that can provide the product or service, right? Now, the other thing they'll do, and it was up on the previous screen, contracting officers a lot of times will go to dynamic small business search. So when you register in SAM to do work with the federal government, and you have to do that, it asks you a whole bunch of questions, revenue, employee. It determines if your size standard is based on employee count, and manufacturing is usually employee count, or revenue count, and services is usually revenue count. And if you're small, it automatically opens up a DSBS, Dynamic Small Business Search profile for you. Now that system, a lot of folks don't realize this. The SAM is under GSA. When it opens that profile, it goes to Dynamic Small Business Search, which is under SBA. And then a lot of folks don't update the past performance. And I heard recently that they just updated DSBS to allow you to put a statement of capability in there too. A lot of folks don't do that. They're like, I'm done with SAM. Well, the contracting officer does market research a lot of times off of Dynamic Small Business Search. So I would go make sure that you're in there and you're updating DSBS. And then the other thing that a lot of folks don't know is, how many folks have a SAM profile? Okay. How many folks update it like regularly? Not just once a year, but regularly. Okay. So a lot of folks don't realize DSBS is like Internet 1.0, right? The last update comes up first in a search, right? So we have clients that'll go in there and put a period at the end of the sentence, and then 2 weeks later go and take out the period at the end of the sentence, or add a sentence, or because literally when the contracting officer goes in there and says, I don't know, building in hazardous material cleanup. The firms that'll come up are the ones that have updated their, in that order, right? So I would encourage you to update your Dynamic Small Business Search regularly. So anyway, so the rule of two, right? So if you're responding to requests for information or sources sought, and you're seeing requirements not get set aside, what I would encourage you to do is identify who the procurement center representative is and approach them. And the SBA, even though they have few PCRs, they're good at their directory. So if you go to the SBA website and you look up PCRs, you'll see which PCR covers which buying activity. And so you can identify the PCR, and every PCR reports to an area director. So you can identify the PCR and you can approach them with, hey, we keep responding to these sources sought. These requirements aren't getting set aside. We need your assistance and support to engage with the contracting officer to make sure that these requirements are getting set aside. A lot of times, we as small businesses are sort of advocates for the program because unfortunately, the small business specialists are understaffed, the PCRs are understaffed. How many 8As do we have? Okay. How's working with your BOSs? So do you have a BOS?
Yeah, it's
Okay. Some are better than others, right? Some district offices have, like when I was running the program, DC district office had 1,200 8A firms. The next highest was Virginia, Richmond, which was 450, and then Baltimore with 425, I think. Some district offices will have like 20, right? So it depends which district office you're in and the assistance that you get from your business opportunity specialist. Once you apply to the 8A program, you're assigned a BOS. And the BOS shouldn't only be doing compliance work, right? Technically, if you go to the Small Business Act and look up Section 8A, that's why they call it the 8A firm. So if you look up Section 8A, there's a host of activities that the BOS is supposed to be doing as far as marketing to the local buying activities, search letters, all sorts of things, right? Unfortunately, BOSs are also overworked. So a lot of times they won't do any of that stuff. They will work on your annual review because they have a requirement to be compliant with annual reviews 100% of the portfolio. So 9 out of 10 times that's what they're working on. So rule of two, really important. Updating your Dynamic Small Business Search, really important. And then the other place that set-asides occur, and the reason set-asides occur, is simplified acquisition threshold. So everything under the simplified acquisition threshold, which is $250,000 now, two things. One is it follows, simplified acquisition threshold follows simplified acquisition procedures. So it's a lot easier for newer firms to sort of play in the simplified acquisition threshold world, right? Because you don't have to be compliant with entire federal acquisition regulations. They're simplified. And everything under SAT, it's funny, SAT and SAP, simplified acquisition threshold and simplified acquisition procedures. Government's great with acronyms. So everything under SAP follows SAP. And it's reserved entirely for small business, right? So when I was responsible for the program, we used to run these numbers, and they still might be on USA Spend. Agencies are technically supposed to hit 100% small business spend under SAT. They don't. But usually there's a reason, right, for the better agencies. There's usually a reason because certain licenses like Cisco, Microsoft, something like that, you can't get it from a small business. So usually if they're at 90%, that's great. But there's some agencies that are like at 60%. And so that's another agency, if you're looking at the simplified acquisition threshold and they're way off, that's a good place to target because they're not meeting their simplified acquisition threshold. The federal government is looking and has been considering, just like they increased the small business 8A goal to 15%, they're looking at increasing the simplified acquisition threshold to either 500,000 or $1 million, which I think would be great. Under the Obama administration, we almost got it to 500,000. Right at the last step, the Office of Trade, and I forget what they're called. I should talk to Kia because they messed it all up. The Office of the Trade Representative, OTR, for whatever reason, and to this day I can't understand why Canada didn't like it, but Canada didn't like it. And so it was an Office of Trade Representative issue, and raising the simplified acquisition threshold didn't happen. But if it can get increased from 250 to 500,000 to $1 million, and that is entirely reserved for small business, that in my mind encourages more small businesses to participate in federal contracting. And if you look at, and if we get to this, what time do I have till, Jess? Okay, I'm working it out in my mind to see if I'm going to get into. I have to what to? Like about 45 more minutes. Oh wow, only? Okay, I'm sorry guys. So if you look at, and we'll get to this, the number of individual federal contractors working with the federal government is declining significantly. Over the last decade, they've lost 60% of participants in federal contracting. So the federal government, I think, Chris, you told me yesterday they had an announcement. They had an announcement when Biden first came in when they increased the goal. They are wanting to cast a broader net and increase participation in small business contracting, right? And not just the traditional small business contractors. They want new firms to participate. So the question is, if you're ready and you think you might qualify, now is probably a good time to be able to enter the federal marketplace. And if they increase the simplified acquisition threshold, that really would help participation and interest from small businesses. Any questions so far? No?
I don't know. For me, I know about the 8A.
Yeah.
My tribe has looked into it. And you answered my question before.
Yeah.
I guess for me, I'm just thinking like, how do you go? Because our tribe, we don't necessarily have a business now. We do housing. We do housing. We have had a daycare. So I'm just trying to think
how to enter it.
What the process is to go from basically nothing.
Yeah.
To being ready to do 8A.
So you got.
It sounds great.
Yeah.
It sounds great. Government contracts. I've heard of people making tons of money off of it, but just basically how to go from having nothing to being how do you do that? Because you say you experience.
Yeah.
I'm thinking like you have to already have a business. You have to already be good at some type of business in order to even apply.
Or have some knowledge of a particular industry. But we've worked with tribes that, bless you, we've worked with tribes that are pretty nascent, right? the one thing that I'd say is having the right partners, right? So having the right partners, because a lot of times, by the way, there are folks that'll be like, hey, you know, Tribe XYZ, let's help you get into the 8A program. And then, okay, so that happens as well. So having the right partners and really mapping it out. Do you guys have an economic development authority?
No.
Or an economic development corp?
No.
Okay, so like that's one of the first things I would look at, because really it all flows down at least an economic development plan. Usually that economic development plan is institutionalized in an authority, right? But it really flows down from that. Do we have and it doesn't have to be, we've worked with tribes where it doesn't have to be, because it can be expensive to get your Section 17 DOI authorized corporation. It doesn't have to be initially a Section 17 licensed entity. It can just be an economic development corp. But that should house a plan, and it should develop a plan for not just entering the federal marketplace, but in my perspective, and the National Center can certainly help with this, and I'm not trying to give you guys more work, Justice Appear, but I'm going to tell her. The National Center actually works with tribes in mapping out their economic development plan, right? What does our 5-year look like? What does our 10-year look like? What does our 15-year look like? And what does it mean with respect to federal contracting, with corporations? We've worked with tribes where, you know, they'll do federal contracting, but then they'll have a C-store and a gas station and lodging and entertainment. So what does that all look like? And I would argue, at least from my perspective, you have to have an economic development plan at a minimum, and then maybe institutionalize it in an economic development corp. And that really lays out, and you know, the National Center, and we work with them, can develop a roadmap for how do you get from A to Z, right? What is the, you need corporate code, you need to establish the entity, you need to have the board, all those things. We can work in developing a roadmap for that. Does that make sense?
I think that's probably what we would need to get our comfort level.
Yeah.
We have done a feasibility study. We had someone from UNC Chapel Hill come
Yeah,
in
awesome.
Growth, basically to do an assessment of what the economic situation is in our community.
Yeah.
You know, how much money goes out, how
How much
what
comes
types
in.
of industries might work in our community, and things like that. So
Yeah.
we have embarked on a few things like that, but I would think that probably having someone to come in to just walk us through it, the whole process.
Yeah.
Of how to get us ready.
Yeah.
To do the.
I'll circle up with Jess and Chris. I don't know if you guys know Chris James, but he's runs the National Center. But I'll circle up with him.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions so far? No? Okay, so I'm going to talk about, because there's a lot of interest in the 8A program. Oh, let's talk about this real quick, because you guys are entering the federal marketplace, right? So even for firms that are already in federal contracting, a lot of folks aren't as familiar with the concern around affiliation, right? So what you normally might do in the private sector can sometimes lead to a concern with respect to affiliation. And why do I say that? Because the first requirement, we'll talk about 8A, HUBZone, women-owned, service-disabled. They're all similar ownership, control, and what's important is size. Number one thing is you have to be small, right? Okay, so small, as I mentioned, is revenue-based. SBA looks at trailing 5 years average revenue, or trailing 2 years employee, if you're employee-based, right? So that's easy enough, right? But some of the things that you might do in the private sector, like teaming oftentimes with the same partner, or joint venturing oftentimes with the same partner, or having common management, or having common space, or common employees, oftentimes those things can lead to what SBA calls a finding of affiliation. And then all of a sudden, when you thought you were small, now what SBA will do is combine your revenues, you and your affiliated firm, to determine if you're still small, right? So you can go out and market, and you know the pipeline for federal contracting can take 12, 18, 24 months. You can win a project, you can get protested, And then SBA will come in with their size specialists and ask a whole bunch of questions and then say, oh, wait a second, you're affiliated with this other company, you're other than small, sorry, you don't get that contract. So it's just awareness. And some of the things are, I always used to say this when I was at the SBA, and some of my folks were like, stop telling that story. It doesn't look good on you. So as I mentioned, I used to do federal contracting in my previous life, right? We used to do USAID, World Bank, that type of work. At the time, bless you, at the time, we used to do a lot of work with Deloitte. And we were a lot of times subcontractor to Deloitte, but sometimes on small business set-aside, we would be the prime. And I'd be like, oh, no problem. Deloitte can do all the work. They can put all the team together. They can write the proposal. Yeah, there's the work share. You have to do 50% of the work share. But guess what? That's ostensible subcontracting. That means you're unduly reliant on a subcontractor. And if you're unduly reliant on a subcontractor, you're going to be found affiliated. And then now, if they combined our revenues with Deloitte's revenues, we'd be other than small. So that's one thing to be aware of, right? A lot of firms have family relationships, like they have common management, common ownership, et cetera. You got to be aware of that. Now, affiliation in and of itself is not a bad word, right? Maybe you are affiliated, but they'll combine your revenues. And if they combine your revenues and you end up being other than small, that's when the problem starts. And you know, when you want to get into the 8A program, you have to be small for your primary NAICS code. And you have to apply under a primary NAICS code. In the SDVOSB and the Hub Zone and the Women-Owned Small Business Program, you can be small in any of the NAICS codes that you work in. For the 8A program, you have to be small in your primary NAICS code, okay? So we had an instance, and I used to always kick myself, because we had an instance where we had, and I'm not saying this to scare you guys, right? But we had an instance where we had, you know, been around the country convincing folks to apply to the 8A program because we wanted more firms, like they do now, more firms in the 8A program. And SDVOSB applied to the 8A program. When they applied to the 8A program, the analyst, which was in the Office of Certification, found that there might be some affiliation between the SDVOSB and his previous employer. So he sent it to the size office, right arm, left arm. Size office says, oh, wait a second, they are affiliated. Here's another one, more than 70% of your revenues come from one source. And in this instance, it was his previous employer. So you guys are affiliated. So you can't, not only can you not get into the 8A program, but guess what? We're going to decertify you in SDVOSB, and you can no longer represent as small. So the firm that came to the SBA to get help and get in the 8A program ended up getting kicked out of the small business program and the SDVOSB program. So I'm not saying that to scare you, but I'm just saying that be aware. And the most challenging part is that the SBA looks at totality of circumstances. And I hated that terminology, right? Because there's no clear, bright red line. It isn't like family member, common office space, joint venture equals affiliation. It's like totality of circumstances. Is it ostensible subcontracting in a joint venture? Is it common management? Is it the 70% rule? They'll look at all those things, and based on the totality of the circumstances, the size official will make a determination. And you can appeal that to the Office of Hearing and Appeals, but you just want to be aware and cognizant of the fact that the federal government looks at partnerships and affiliation very differently than you might in the private sector. Does that make sense? Any questions? Yes, sir.
Just a comment, and I know that Vice Chief, yes, thank you. It looks like it's an uphill battle, and you might not have any built-in for your tribe. You might not have any built-in specialization or businesses that you're doing. I can tell you from our tribe is a very small tribe in remote Alaska. They don't have any resources. They don't have any businesses. Rippies is about the most. If anybody's been in one of our areas, Rippies are tear off or like scratch offs. But they needed revenue coming in continually recirculated within the tribal community, and that's what we were doing. And so we took on this because Sharon and I are retired vets, and IT was we had offered, in fact, they asked us to help create a business. It could be a resource within the tribal community that has a specialization. That's how you can start a business.
Yeah. Or a minority partner.
Or from scratch,
Yeah.
from nothing, no businesses before, to a holding company and now to 8A certified tribal-owned subsidiary companies. It can be done.
Yeah.
So I know there's a lot of scary stuff, a lot of
And that's a really,
That's what happened with us. We had someone, well, I think we had reached out to show some interest in starting the 8A, but then we had an individual come in, basically said they would be our partner, and the tribe would own 51% of the company, and then they would own 49%, and we basically use their expertise to start the business, and that's kind of how it was pitched to us.
yeah. And so here's the thing, you have to be really careful. It goes back to the governance issue, right? We've had clients that have come to us when, and I hate this because I used to face this at the SBA too, when the 8A entity has quote unquote gone rogue, right? Is no longer reporting to council or to the Section 17, isn't submitting financials, and there's a little bit of a flaw in the SBA's program because all the communication with the SBA happens at the entity level. So it doesn't necessarily happen with the parent or the holding company. So there has to be strong governance. When you were talking about, well, how do they continue to report? The strategic vision, the strategic numbers, reporting, hiring happens at the discretion of the holding company board, which is majority tribal members. That 8A reports, it's like a corporate entity, right? It's just like GM, they report to the board. The board has to control. And so they have to report regularly to you. But that governance needs to be there. And so yes, you can have outside partners, they can be 49% owner, but that governance has to be there and that control needs to be maintained. So this is a good segue into the 8A program. So I'll just talk about the basics, right? We just talked about having to be small. Oh, yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
So my question is, okay, if it's my individual business,
Yeah,
then that person is certifying as an 8A.
correct.
What's the difference in the tribally owned entity?
The tribe owns it. So the tribe,
So there's nobody that certifies.
the tribe, so the first time a tribe applies, so Alaska Native Corporation by definition in ANCSA, Alaska Native corporations don't have to demonstrate economic disadvantage status. The first time a tribe applies to the 8A program, they have to demonstrate that the underlying tribal population is economically disadvantaged. First time they do that, then every other time it's easy to, then it's just an 8A application, so they can have multiple. So when an individual applies, that individual has to be socially and economically disadvantaged. Social disadvantaged is the presumed, African American, Hispanic American, Asian Pacific Islander, et cetera. Those are the presumed classes. You can also get into the 8A program if you're not in one of the presumed classes. Oh, Native American, obviously. You can get into the 8A program even if you're not in one of the presumed classes. So we used to have, and we still do in the 8A program, Caucasian females. Why? In the construction industry, for an example, or engineering industry, because they have been significantly discriminated in that industry. Now, you also can't just say, oh, I was discriminated and not connect the dots. You have to say I was discriminated against, however, that ended up in ... not getting a job, or not getting a loan, or not getting an education. So it's not just I was discriminated if you're looking, and it's called a case of preponderance, right? You have to demonstrate through preponderance that even though you don't fall into one of the presumed classes, that discrimination resulted in negative impact to your ability to be successful. So economic disadvantaged, and these are all in the slide, right? Well, let me take one step back. So we talked about small, because this is important. So we talked about small, right? You have to be small. The other is control. So when you talk about the disadvantaged individual applying to the 8A program. Where a lot of firms get into trouble is check, socially disadvantaged. Check, small. Control, there is overt control and negative control, right? So just because you own 51%, which meets the ownership check mark, doesn't mean you meet the control check mark. If there are supermajority requirements in your operating agreement where but for the vote of your minority owner, you can't get a resolution passed, SBA will say that's negative control. If there's unanimous consent provisions, SBA will say that's negative control. If your minority partner puts up $1 million and you don't put up anything, SBA is going to say, oh, wait a second. I know on paper you control, but that person just put up $1 million. I mean, you're obviously going to have to listen to them. So there are instances. So you have size, you have ownership, but you also have to look at control. So the way the operating agreement, or if it's a corporation, the way the bylaws are established, have to demonstrate that you also have control and there's no negative control. And then what you look beyond the operating agreements or the bylaws is, are there any loans, investments that can potentially lead to a finding of negative control? So those are the issues that you need to be concerned about. So, and then with the 8A program, obviously socially disadvantaged, and we talked about presumed class or preponderance, and then economic disadvantage. So for individuals, and I think the numbers are up here in this slide somewhere, for individuals, it's net personal net worth, right? So personal net worth takes out your value of your business, it takes out your principal residence, and it takes out your retirement account. So if that's below 750, you're good. If your AGI, your average gross income, 3 years, is below 350, you're good. And then they throw everything back in, but you can still keep out your retirement, and it's $6 million. Okay? So those are, if you're thinking about applying to the 8A program, those are the basic requirements, right? You're small, ownership, control, right? And then economic disadvantaged and social disadvantaged. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Has anybody applied to the 8A program and is waiting to hear? You're applying this year? Okay. Okay. Has anybody gotten through the certification program recently? I'm sorry? You're graduated. Okay. When did you graduate?
2016.
Okay. Cool. Okay.
I've managed other AAs, but this is.
You're first.
Yeah, now that my business is 18 years old, I'm going to go ahead and take it to
Okay. Yes, sir.
No, you're asking, and we just, AFL
Oh,
just got
yeah.
certified.
Yeah.
Second 8A.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions on 8A so far? So the one thing that I'd say is 8A is extremely unique in sole source, right? So the other socio categories have sole source authority, but they're very different than 8A. So if you think you can qualify for 8A, number one, be prepared to take advantage of the entire 9 years, right? Number two, understand how to market and take advantage of the sole source authority. It's unique because up to the threshold, $4.5 million, the contracting officer doesn't have to write a justification or approval. The contracting officer can do a government price estimate. They can, bless you, they can do a short analysis, and they can go ahead and award a sole source award to the 8A company. Again, to native or entity owned, it can be unlimited, but individually it can be up to $4.5 million. In the other programs, and we'll talk real quick about the requirements on the other programs, there is sole source authority, but the contracting officer has to justify that you're the only firm that can provide that product or service, right? So a lot of times, like, contracting officers don't want to do a J&A over justification and approval over the sole source thresholds for entity owned, right? 22, 25 million and 100 million, right? Similarly, in order to do a sole source, let's say for women owned, they have to write a justification and have it approved that you are the only woman-owned small business that can provide that product or service. And so they're reluctant to do that. Now, when I was responsible for the program, we would argue with contracting officers and give them guidance to be creative, right? Because we wanted to see more sole sources in the Hub Zone, women-owned, service-disabled program. And so we would argue that, hey, you can write the justification saying, this is the only woman-owned small business in this jurisdiction that can provide this product or service. Or this is the only woman-owned small business with this particular past performance. So you can be creative, and some contracting officers are willing to work with you, but if you look at the numbers, sole source doesn't occur that often in the other socio categories. So if you think you qualify for the 8A program, I would apply for it, but I would do it when you're ready and you can really benefit from the 9 years being in the program. Any questions? Okay, real quick, I want to talk about the others, and then I want to talk about mentor protege because there's newer firms. And how much time do I have?
You're still
Okay.
You've got like 20.
Okay. All right, so real quick, Hub Zone. Hub Zone, I would encourage you, if you think you qualify for Hub Zone, apply for that as well. Why? Because the federal government hasn't met its Hub Zone goal in like forever, right? And it's only 3%. So how do you qualify for a Hub Zone? One, you have to be small, right? But it doesn't matter who the individual is. As long as your principal office, and that's not your headquarters, I'll tell you the definition of principal office. As long as your principal office is in a Hub Zone, a historically underutilized business zone, and SBA doesn't make those zones up, Housing and Urban Development makes it up, but the SBA has a great website where you can put your address in and it'll tell you if it's in a Hub Zone. As long as your principal office is in a Hub Zone and 35% of your employees live in a Hub Zone, not the same Hub Zone, any Hub Zone, then you can qualify for the program, right? So we have clients that will hire, and then an employee is anybody that works 40 hours a month, right? Not a week, a month. So we have clients that'll hire interns from college towns who work remotely, right? 40 hours a month, you jack up your employee numbers, and now you can hit your 35%. When you do the analysis for principal office is where most employees work. So it's not your headquarters, right? So if you have two offices, some of our clients will say, oh, wow, I have 3 people here and 2 people here, but this is in a Hub Zone and this one isn't. Just move one person over, right? And when you do the Hub Zone analysis, you can exclude project site employees. So if you have someone working at HHS or Aberdeen on a project, you exclude them. So anybody else that's left, let's say you have 5 people left, the majority of them work in a Hub Zone, you qualify under that category. You get the check mark for principal office, then you have to meet the 35% employee requirement. And again, because the federal government isn't meeting it, if you're woman-owned and Hub Zone, you're more attractive to the contracting officer, or 8A and Hub Zone, you're more attractive. For tribes, the one thing that I'll say is you have an exemption from Hub Zone participation rules. So as a tribe, you can apply to the program and say, hey, I don't have a principal. First of all tribal land is considered Hub Zone land, so it's pretty easy to meet that requirement. But you can say, I don't have either. I don't have a principal office in a Hub Zone, and 35% of my employees don't live in Hub Zones. But I promise, next time I win a Hub Zone set-aside contract, that 35% of the staff on that contract will come from my community, our tribal community, or the area surrounding our tribal community, right? So, loophole. A tribe gets into the program by promising that when they win a Hub Zone contract, they will hire 35% from their community or from the jurisdiction around their community, right? But guess what? They never pursue a HubZone contract, right? But they remain HubZone certified. So now they're HubZone certified. They've never had to meet any of the requirements. But then when they go after an unlimited sole source, the federal government gets $100 million in credit for 8A and $100 million in credit for HubZone. So that's just a strategy for tribally owned firms. Like I said, the sole source is not as lucrative, if you want to put it that way, as the 8A program. And there used to be, the program has become much more stable because it used to be if your HubZone employee moved, all of a sudden you lost one of the 35%, right? But now, if the HubZone employee is employed by you or living in a HubZone 180 days before your application to 180 days after your application, once a HubZone employee, always a HubZone employee. So if that jurisdiction changes and is no longer HubZone certified, or if your employee makes a lot of money and decides to move to a different area, as long as they remain on your payroll uninterrupted, once a HubZone employee, always a HubZone employee. So the program, it used to be really difficult, and contracting officers, quite frankly, didn't like it because it would always get protested. Why? Because you apply today, you don't get the contract till like, I don't know, 18, 24 months later. You probably have lost an employee or two. So if you win and I'm competing with you, I'm going to protest because the HubZone program was also the only program that required compliance with the program at time of offer and at time of award. Every other program is at only at time of offer. So that was an easy protest because 9 out of 10 times you probably lost a HubZone employee, you would lose out and they'd have to go to the second ranked. And then the second rank would get protested and then so on and so on. And that's why contracting officers didn't like the HubZone program. That's why the SBA updated the HubZone program to make it more stable. And no longer are they required to comply with requirements at time of offer and award. It's at the time of every annual certification. So they'll look back at your last certification and say, hey, show us that you complied at this time of recertification. As long as you're compliant at that time of recertification, and you have to do it every year, then you're okay. You can't be protested. Any questions on the HubZone program? Yes, sir.
You're not describing anything theoretical. This is actually the way it works.
Yeah.
So we use the loophole to get HubZone, right? Well, it's an exception.
No, it's a great, yeah.
For tribes. And all the agencies, we got our first Prime 8A contract last year. Nice $11 million contract. And the agency's not going to award a HubZone set aside. They'll award us under the 8A program as a tribal 8A.
Yeah.
Love it, and they get credit
Yep.
because we're HubZone. Tribal entities that are in the 8A program only can qualify for 2 socioeconomic categories. The small
Yeah.
disadvantaged, right, and then the HubZone. Because they're entity owned, they can't qualify as a woman-owned small business or service disabled veteran. Those are the only 2. If you get both of those, HubZone is a great benefit for agencies because they're not making their HubZone goals, and they're going to award to you under the 8A program, not under a HubZone
Yep.
set aside. So it's great. The agency loved it.
Yeah.
We did that.
Yeah.
So it's not
It helps them meet their, and by the way, if the goals are going up, and they are, for 8A, again, tribal entities, it's easier to award one $20 million, $30 million, $40 million contract than 10 $4.5 million contracts, right? So tribal entities, now is, if you're looking at entering the 8A program, now is a good time because the federal government is going to have to hit 15% by 2025. They're going to look to do larger and larger sole source opportunities. And if they can get HubZone credit while they're doing it, it's more attractive to them. Yeah. So how many people who are doing current federal work are in a mentor-protege relationship? Just you guys? Wow. Okay. How many people are doing current federal work? Okay. Okay. So real quick, the mentor-protege program started in the 8A program, right? SBA actually, it wasn't statutory. SBA started a program under regulatory authorization. They wrote the regs in the 8A program, and they said, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could team up a nascent 8A with a mentor right? Maybe a large firm, but maybe a graduating 8A. And that mentor can help them with 5 different areas, right? And we can talk about this. I know we have limited time, but there's 5 different areas that the mentor can help you with. What am I lacking? Am I lacking networks and business development capacity? Am I lacking contract implementation, program implementation? Am I lacking systems, infrastructure, accounting? There is even international trade. Your mentor doesn't have to provide all of these, but the mentor should provide some of those. Now, if I'm a protege, so the thought process was, the protege can benefit from mentor experience, right? And then you can do a joint venture. So what is a joint venture? A joint venture is a new entity that's owned majority by the protege, minority by the member, in this sense, the mentor. Again, you have to demonstrate ownership and control. So when you do a joint venture, you have to demonstrate that the protege owns 51, but the protege also controls. So you can't have unanimous consent provisions in that operating agreement either. So now, benefits are flowing from mentor to protege in one of these areas. You do a joint venture, but the mentor can do 60% of what the joint venture does, right? So think about it this way. You're a protege, and this isn't usually going to happen, but you're a protege, you're an 8A, you team up with Lockheed. Lockheed is your mentor. They're going to provide all sorts of assistance. They're going to help you win business and implement it, right? Before, they couldn't do any work on an 8A sole source. But now, because they teamed up with you and you did a joint venture and you won that work under that joint venture, they can do 60% of that 8A set aside or 8A sole source, right? So that's the incentive to the mentor to participate in a mentor-protege and then the joint venture. Now, as a protege, I'd be really careful. So a lot of times folks are like, now the thing is that this used to only be in the 8A program. Small Business Jobs Act of 2010 said included in the other socio categories. Then in 2013 they came back and said just make it all small. So it took the better part of 6 years to launch the program into all small. So now all small businesses, women-owned, hubs-owned, service-disabled can participate in the mentor-protege program, right? But I'd be really careful if you're the protege. It's a great program to partner with a firm that can provide the necessary assistance. But you only get 2. If you're individually owned, you only get 2 in your entire lifetime. Now tribes, you know, you can get 2 for your first 8A, you can get 2 for your second 8A, and so forth, right? But as an individually owned firm, you only get 2. So you got to be really selective. A lot of times some of our clients are like, oh, I want Lockheed. Number 1, Lockheed is going to be very selective. They're not just going to pick anyone. Number 2, Lockheed only gets 3 proteges at any given point, right? So with all their subsidiaries and wholly owned companies, they only ever get 3 at any point. Now, they can rotate those out. It's a 3 + 3 year program. So the program's 3 years, it gets renewed for an additional 3 years. And they can rotate their proteges out, but they're going to be very selective. And if I'm advising a small business, number 1 is do a gap analysis. See exactly, but for the following, I could be competitive, right? Decide what that is. And then this is the mentor that brings that to the table. 9 out of 10 times when we do that analysis, that mentor is someone that's been through the 8A program or a women-owned small business that's been really successful because they've been in your shoes, right? They've grown the business, they've made it successful. Maybe if you have 2, one is, I'm sorry, one is a graduate, and then the other one is, I don't know, a AECOM, a Deloitte, a Serco, a Boeing, et cetera. But be very selective. And then the other thing is you have to report, just like in the 8A program where you have annual reviews, in the mentor-protege program, you have to report every year, right? So you want to be able to report benefits are flowing from mentor to protege. So when we advise a protege, we always say, hey, by the way, it's a template. The agreement itself is a template. It's on the website. You go in there, you can probably fill it out on your own. initial preamble about why you want to do the mentor-protege and why the mentor is relevant to what you're doing and can provide the assistance is important. And then the chart, which says what benefits are flowing from mentor to protege, is important. The rest of it is a template. So when you fill out the chart, what we tell proteges is be very specific. You want to be like, you know, Joe Smith is going to provide accounting services or assistance or a system and so, and this is the time frame, and this is how we're going to track it, and this is what they're going to deliver, right? Be very specific, because otherwise you can't hold your mentor accountable. When we advise a mentor, and I say this a little bit jokingly, but kind of honestly too. When we advise a mentor, we're like, hey, be a little bit fuzzy and gray, because you're going to have to report against this, right? And you want to be able to demonstrate success, because SBA can technically restrict bad mentors from participating in the MPA program in the future. So you want to develop a chart that you can deliver against. So the actual truth is, it's got to be somewhere in the middle, right? Develop something that you're definitely going to benefit from, because you have two mentor proteges or two mentors, but make it, I don't want to say easy, but make it achievable, because you're going to have to report against it. So once you create that MPA, then you can do a joint venture with your partner. Now, if you did a joint venture, if you as a small business did a joint venture with AECOM, that would be affiliated, and that would be other than small. But because you have a mentor-protege relationship, it's exempted from that affiliation. So anything that's in that mentor-protege agreement, if you're going to do joint ventures, put it in the mentor-protege agreement. A mentor can acquire up to 40%, although we don't recommend this because you got to have an exit plan. A mentor can acquire up to 40% equity in your company without finding of affiliation. 10 minutes. So, see, I told you I could probably talk for an hour and a half. Sorry, guys. If you guys look tired, but I appreciate your patience. But if whatever assistance is going to flow from mentor to protege, put it in there. And then that's all exempted from affiliation, right? So now you do a joint venture. Why is the joint venture important? Number one, as I said, the mentor can do 60% of the work, so that's interest to them. Number two, the joint venture inherits the past performance and qualifications of both members, right? So now you do a joint venture. Let's say the managing member, the one that owns 51%, is a tribal 8A. The minority member or partner member, let's say, is Lockheed, right? So now you have this joint venture. It's a legal entity. This joint venture is now a tribal 8A because the managing member is a tribal 8A. However, it has the past performance and experience of both members. That means technically it has the past performance and experience of Lockheed. So now you have a tribal 8A that has the past performance of Lockheed that can go after unlimited sole source, right? That's really the key. Now, there's been a whole bunch of recent court cases where GAO and Court of Federal Claims have said, well, the protege has to put at least one past performance in there. Otherwise, how do we know that they can do any of this work? So and they keep going back. You know, I think it was on Oasis where they said, you know, all three have to come from the protege, and then there was the next one that said, well, no, two can come. I mean, so that's been going back and forth. But technically, according to SBA rules, the past performance and qualifications of both members flow to the joint venture. That, by the way, includes facilities clearance. So if you're doing secured work, I think someone was talking about doing secured work earlier, that includes facilities securities clearance. Now, again, DOD will argue, no, the joint venture has to have the clearance. SBA will say, no, our rules prevail. No matter who has the clearance, it flows to the joint venture. The latest court case said, if you are doing the principal work that requires the clearance and you have it and the other member doesn't have it, then it's okay. So DoD still hasn't officially agreed to that, but technically speaking, because that, I mean, that's another area. If you're doing federal contract work, if you're looking at the Department of Defense, one of the things you eventually want to look at is facility security clearance, right? Getting that is like the chicken and the egg. A lot of times, a mentor, like a Lockheed, like a AECOM or Deloitte, will sponsor their protege to get that clearance. So how does that work? You do a mentor-protege relationship. The mentor gives you a subcontract, then says, oh, this subcontract needs securities clearance. We'll sponsor them for their securities clearance. So then the mentor sponsors you for your securities clearance. That's a easier way of being able to get your securities clearance. And then with the joint ventures, so you have your mentor-protege relationship, you have your joint ventures, they can go after unlimited sole source. The joint venture is a limited lifetime entity, right? So it's 2 years. There used to be this convoluted 3-2 rule, 2 years, 3 contracts, but they simplified it. 2-year lifetime for that joint venture. Now, it doesn't mean that once you get to the year 2, end of year 2, you can't accept any bids that had been out, right? So you might have 10 bids out that you've already bid on. You can accept those. You just can't put out new bids. And then the other thing is that as long as you have your MPA and it's your 6-year term, you can always create joint venture number 2, joint venture number 3, joint venture number 4. As long, and SBA has held that at some point, one JV is too many and we might find you affiliated, but as long as I was in the agency and as long as I've been out, there have never been too many JVs under an MPA to find you affiliated. The one thing that I'll say is you can do a small to small JV, right? So if you're a hub zone company and you want to team up with an 8A and you want the 8A to be the 51% owner because you want the JV to inherit 8A status, you can do small to small without an MPA. But if you do JV number 1, JV number 2, JV number 3 without the MPA, you're going to be found affiliated eventually, especially if most of your revenue is coming from that joint venture. So you just want to be cautious. With the MPA, you're exempted from affiliation. You can do small to small joint ventures to get, and sometimes, by the way, the example I gave you, the hub zone and the 8A, so they'll do 2 joint ventures. On one, the 8A will be 51%. On the other, the hub zone will be 51%. So now they have 2 vehicles where they can go after 8A contracts and they can go after hub zone contracts. So you want to be careful because you might be found affiliated if a lot of your revenues are coming from that relationship. Let me stop there. I think I'm pretty close. Any questions? No questions? I put you guys to sleep. I'm sorry. So the one thing that I'd say is the Mentor Protege program is a great opportunity to team up. It creates a very interesting joint venture structure to pursue set-aside opportunities, but structure it correctly. The other thing that, I'm sorry, one more thing. The other thing that I'd say is, used to be on 8A joint ventures, they all had to be approved by the district office. So talking about your BOS, they all had to go to the BOS. It'd sit there forever to get approved. Now it's only sole source 8A opportunities that are, only JVs that are pursuing a sole source opportunity have to go to the SBA. And the process is even streamlined to a checklist. However, even if it doesn't have to be approved by the SBA, so if you do a hub zone joint venture or a women-owned joint venture or a service-disabled joint venture, nobody's approving that on the front end, but you could get protested. And a lot of joint ventures have been winning contracts because of the unique qualification flow, right, from both members. So a lot of joint ventures are getting protested. And if you don't set it up correctly, where the managing member really controls, so a lot of times, like when we had a large multi-billion-dollar IT services company, a mentor, a tribal entity, and they created a joint venture, right? They're highly successful, right? They keep winning stuff. But the multi-million-dollar IT services company was like, whoa, I don't like this no unanimous consent provision. So their lawyers were reluctant to just hand over the keys to the protege, right? Because like, you're going to commit me. So they wrote in some requirements that require the consent of the minority member. Now, they went in eyes open, knowing that if they get protested, depending on whose desk it ends up on, there might be a totality of circumstances that leads to the finding of affiliation. But the mentor in this instance was like, I get it. We're going to take the risk because I'm not just handing over the keys. So they put in limits like, if it's a contract over 100 million or if it's a contract over 50 million, you need authority from both members to pursue it. If you're going to file a lawsuit, you need both. And SBA is sometimes okay with those unique, extraordinary circumstances. But just make sure you create the joint venture agreement in a way that will, more likely than not, pass a potential protest, because you don't want to have put the whole thing together, pursued 18, 24, 36 months, and then get a protest and lose it because the joint venture agreement wasn't established correctly. So thank you guys for your patience. I appreciate it. Thank you, Jess. Appreciate it.